Okay, so good evening, everyone, both virtual and the hardy souls who come live. So what I wanted to do this evening really is try and run through, practically speaking, what a Pruzbul is and how it works and what the halachas are. And then if there's time, explore some of the background, conceptual framework that lies behind it. And in addition, for those who are live, do a live Pruzbul arrangement, which is definitely the better way of doing it than just doing it virtually. But I'll explain also how the virtual arrangement works. So first of all, let's start with the psukim. So these are psukim in Parshas Re'eh, and they tell us that Mekates Sheva Shonim Tase Shemitta. At the end of 7 years, you should do a Shemitta. Now, Shemitta means lots of things. The literal meaning of the word Shemitta is withdrawal, and we have become familiar over the last year with the agricultural element of that withdrawal, which is that the farmers step back from farming the land, they step back from the normal rights of ownership and allow unfettered access to anyone who wants to come in, and so on and so forth. That's been the agricultural laws of Shemitta that we've been dealing with over the last year. But here, the Torah tells us there's an additional Shemitta halacha. I'm just muting everyone because I'm getting a little bit of interference. There's an additional Shemitta halacha, which is the withdrawal from the right to claim loans. And the Pasuk says that this occurs Mekates Sheva Shonim, at the end of 7 years, which seems to imply that the effectiveness of this Shemitta, the withdrawal from loans, is at the end of the Shemitta year rather than throughout the year or at the beginning of the year. In other words, if we know that Shemitta cancels debts, or at least removes the right to claim a debt, we could speculate whether that occurs at the beginning of Shemitta, throughout Shemitta. So if at any stage during Shemitta you make a loan, it's immediately cancelled throughout the whole length of the year, or it's cancelled at the end of the Shemitta. Most of the poskim understands, as per the simplest reading of the pasuk, Mekates Sheva Shonim is the end of 7 years. In other words, Shemitta that cancels debts is at the end of the 7 years. In other words, with the conclusion of this year, which admits Hashem will occur Sunday evening at sunset as we transition into the next year. So that's the moment of the cancellation of the debt. This is the pasuk in Devarim, in Re'eh Perek Tesvav, chapter 15. So Mekates Sheva Shonim Tase Shemitta, says the pasuk. At the end of 7 years, Shemitta occurs. This is Dvar HaShemitta. So what sort of withdrawal are we speaking about? We had to say we're not talking about agricultural withdrawal. That's a separate halacha. Shomot kol ba'al mashe yodu. Every creditor shall release the debts that are owed to them. Asher yasher b'rei, that normally that they've lent to their fellow. Lo yigos esreo ves achiv. One shouldn't pressure or demand or claim from one's fellow. Kikora Shemitta al Hashem, because this year or this moment is a moment of withdrawal where we to Hashem. Then the pasuk says, "As a nochri tikos." This halacha doesn't apply to debts which are owed to those who are not part of Bnei Israel. However, debts which are between members of Klal Yisrael get cancelled. Then the pasuk seems to offer some reasons for this unusual and interesting halacha. Efes ki lo yeh b'cha evyon, or may either reasons or maybe a resultant reward for keeping this halacha, or perhaps a hope that there shouldn't be amongst us poor people. Ki vorich yivrach Hashem ba'aretz, Hashem will bless us in the land which He has given us. Only then the pasuk hey, only if we listen, rak im shemaya tishma b'kol Hashem lekecha, if we listen to the voice of Hashem your God. So this is the pasuk that debts are cancelled. Now the Rishonim speculate as to the reason for this unusual halacha, because what the halacha effectively says is that you owe me money, I lent you money, and nonetheless Shemitta comes and I'm unable to claim it, and perhaps the debt is even cancelled. And a number of suggestions are put forward. The Moran of Nevuchim, the Rambam in his guides to the Prepex, says that this is a way of ensuring that no one gets too deep into debt. So every 7 years, debts are cancelled and poor people are thus alleviated of the debt regime. The Chinuch discusses other reasons for this. He says maybe it's an aspect of chesed, it's extraordinary kindness to absolve people of the money they owe. And therefore this is the background to this. Maybe he says it's to do with betochen and trust in Hashem. We remind ourselves that at the end of the day, that despite the normal workings of the economic system, nonetheless, ultimately we're in the hands of Hashem, in which case it would fit into the general theme of Shemitta, which both allows poor people access to fields and also is a recognition that ultimately our agricultural efforts only have some effect, but at the end of the day we are in the hands of Hashem. The Chinuch also says an interesting thing. He says it's a 7-yearly reminder of the dangers of theft, of gezel. He says, if I'm not even allowed to claim my own debts out of obedience to Hashem, how much more so I shouldn't start claiming money which isn't my due. So it's a reminder of honesty and so on. The reasons the Chinuch gives. Other Rishonim say, all these reasons are linked. Other Rishonim say it's a 7-yearly reminder that we shouldn't become enslaved to our work, to our financial dealings. So in the same way as the farmer has a 7-yearly reminder, which the farmer steps back from farming once every 7 years. So all of us have to step back once every 7 years and sort of withdraw ourselves from the financial system. So it's interesting. All these sources seem to understand that it's a reasonable halacha. It's an extraordinary one. It's an unusual one. It's one that can work within a viable economic system and serves the purpose of inculcating in us values of the Torah. There is an Acher in one of the senior poskim in the Shulchan Aruch, who lived a century after the author of the Shulchan Aruch in Poland, the Jewisha, and he says he thinks this is a chayk. He says this is such an extraordinary halacha. The idea that every 7 years you cancel debts seems such a rupture within the normal working of how any society can function. We should view this as a chayk. I suppose analogous really to the whole idea of Shemitta, that every 7 years farmers down their tools and just hand over panosa. The national livelihood is handed over to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. This isn't a normal functioning of society. We shouldn't view this as regular societal functioning. Mishpat, where we give reasons for monetary laws, is don't steal, don't damage people, be honest in business, these sorts of things. But the Shemitta is above and beyond any normal practice. It says this should be viewed as a chayk. This is how they understand it. Be that as it may, this halacha created considerable problems and tensions. Now, many halachas make our life challenging. The issue here was that, in a sense, there was a clash between halachic values, because the same Torah which tells us that debts are cancelled also tells us that we have a mitzvah in Kesef Talveh. There's a mitzvah to loan each other money. Loaning money is an enormous chesed. Tzedakah, it's a type of tzedakah really. By giving up our own money and giving it as a gift to someone, that's classic tzedakah, classic charity. But by lending someone, we also enable people to function. It helps smooth over when there's a cash flow problem. It buys them time so that they can sort their lives out. It gives them investment capital so that they can start their own business. In fact, in many instances, it's a higher form of tzedakah because it avoids the embarrassment that can go with receiving a free gift, and also empowers a person to earn their own way and pay their own way. So there's a mitzvah to lend money. More than that, the Pasuk tells us that we shouldn't resist lending money because of the Shemitta cancellation of debts. And as we shouldn't say, how can I lend money? If I do so, Shemitta will cancel the debt. We should trust and we should continue to lend money. Now, Hillel observed the situation in his generation. So we're talking about pre-destruction of the second Beit Din by a considerable amount of time, by perhaps over a century, 150 years or so. Hillel observed the situation, and he saw that people were desisting from lending money. They weren't lending money because of the Shemitta. So now we have a problem. On the one hand, we have the halachas of the Shemitta. On the other hand, we have people therefore in breach of the chesed, the mitzvah of the chesed of loaning money, and in breach of the law which says don't desist, avoid loaning money because of the laws of Shemitta. And in addition, on a functional level, society can't work, poor people are left stranded without loans and the ability to borrow. So this isn't working. So he created a takana, an institution called the Pruzbul. The Gemara in Gittin explains, this is Gemara in Gittin, Lamed Vov Omid Beis. The Gemara says translation of the word Pruzbul. Pruz is a word for a document, shtar, that's what it is, a document. Bul is the translation in Aramaic of rich. There's two words. Initially, this legislation was actually called Pruzbul Buti. Buti is the word for poor, and Bul in Aramaic is the word for rich. A document which is a solution for the problems of the rich and the poor. In other words, Shemitta creates problems for the poor because they can't get debts. It creates problems for the rich because they don't lend money and they lose this opportunity of chesed, and they end up being transgressing the prohibition of not lending money. And therefore, this is the creation of Pruzbul Debts, the creation of a document to resolve the problems of the rich and the poor. We nowadays shorten that to Pruzbul, the document made for the rich. So Hillel enacted a solution, as it were, in order to circumvent, in some respects, the halachas of Shemitta. Now, how does this solution work, and how can it be that he could do this? I mean, after all, the halachas of Shemitta are very clear. These are Torah laws. How could it be that Hillel, who, as I mentioned, lived a century before the Common Era or so 150 years before the Chum Beit Hamikdash, how could he come along as a member of Chazal and achieve this? So the basic answer to this question is that the Pasuk already indicates that the prohibition of claiming a debt, the prohibition of claiming a debt, is when this is a personal claim of money. The Pasuk says that a person, an individual, shouldn't be able to claim money. However, if this is an institutional claim, a communal claim against someone, or this is a claim being made by Beit Din, such a claim can be made. And in fact, we already find, long before the era of Hillel, those who are concerned about a debt either being cancelled through Shemitta or other fears that the borrower would somehow wrangle out of paying the debt, could hand over the shtoros, the documents, to Beit Din, and then Beit Din would enforce the claiming of the debt. Now, why would it be that if Beit Din is claiming a debt, the cancellation of the debt via Shemitta wouldn't apply? So either this is because the cancellation of a debt is a personal halachic requirement, not one that applies to an institutional or communal body like the Beit Din, or because once the debt has been handed over to Beit Din, it is enforceable and therefore in a sense already claimed. In other words, the weakness of a debt is I don't have cash in hand, I need to make a claim against you. But once it's already being dealt with by Beit Din, who have the power to enforce, at least amongst those who observe halacha, and in the time when Jews had autonomy, even amongst everyone, so the debt is already in the hands of Beit Din and already in the process of being claimed. Therefore, Shemitta will not cancel the debt. So this was the classic position. Hillel came along, according to this school of thought, and streamlined and simplified the process in order to make it accessible to everyone, so people wouldn't be deterred from lending money. And basically, he did three things. The first is he avoided the need to actually take your documents of debt to Beit Din and hand them over to Beit Din. He said it is simply sufficient to make a declaration in front of a Beit Din, declaring that all claims that I have on people should be handed over to your care. So this was the first thing that Hillel said. Rather than me actually needing to mount a claim in Beit Din in which I hand over the debts to Beit Din and start the process, I simply make a declaration, and we'll talk in a few minutes about how a Pruzbul actually works, how this is achieved in practice. But I simply make a declaration in front of witnesses, in front of Beit Din, we'll discuss the details, and declare in a Pruzbul document that all debts that I have, without specifying the sums of money involved, without specifying the debtors and who it is that I've lent the money to, without even at this moment perhaps being aware myself. In other words, I haven't formed in my mind a list of all the specific cases, and therefore in a sense what he's doing is I'm just making a general declaration. Any debts that I have should be handed over to the responsibility of Beit Din. So this is the leniency in a sense number one that he instituted in order to streamline the process. I don't actually need to take tangible debts and hand them over to Beit Din. I can just make it as a general declaration. Number two, he arranged that this process should work even for debts about which I have no documentation. So the reality is, if I embark on a loan which is significant, we normally document it. This is known as a shtar. I have a shtar chov, which is signed, in which I can use a piece of paper to make a claim on you to claim my debt. However, relatively trivial sums, or perhaps people that I trust, I may not bother using a shtar, I may not document it, and as long as we both trust each other, that can work perfectly viably. So many debts do not have a shtar, do not have documentation listing the debt, and therefore as such can't really be handed over to Beit Din. They're not enforceable in the normal manner. There's no shtar to hand over to Beit Din. Nonetheless, the takana, the legislation of Pruzbul that Hillel created, is sufficient for that too, and therefore he said even the debt that can't be handed over to Beit Din through the handing over shtar, there is no documentation, nonetheless you can create a Pruzbul for. Of course, if the borrower chooses to deny it, they can do so. But as long as the borrower is in agreement that they owe the money, I can now avoid the debt being cancelled by handing over to Beit Din, even though there's no shtar, there's no document. And the third element that Hillel created was that Beit Din in turn now allow me to claim the debt. So effectively, I don't anymore need Beit Din actually to claim the debt. They empower me to claim the debt. And if I can go up to you as an individual and say, pay me back the money because I've created a Pruzbul. So effectively what Hillel has done has taken a genuine and cumbersome mechanism in which genuinely I start the process of handing over my debts and the claimant of my debts to Beit Din, in which case there needs to be a shtar, there needs to be a document. It needs to be genuinely handed over to Beit Din specifically and on a case-by-case basis. And certainly needs to be a debt where there is documentation, where there is a shtar. And then Beit Din are the ones who actually make the claim. And through a sort of streamlining of the process, he removed the need to actually physically hand over shtaros, removed the need to have a specific debt specified, removed the need to even have a debt which has a documentation at all, and then said that Beit Din effectively in turn authorized me to now claim the debt myself. And therefore, on a practical, lived basis, we have a very neat, simple solution in which I can continue to function. You know, Alex, will you just close the door there, sorry. I can continue to function and claim my debt without, thank you, without any visible differentiation, because I have, I'm able to claim the debt myself. So this is what Hillel did through his legislation of Pruzbul. Now, the Gemara discusses extensively the parameters of this piece of legislation and also the mechanism through which it can work. And there are a number of models of how to understand this. First of all, it may well be that this decree was rolled out over several generations. For example, Hillel, as I mentioned, lives in the era of the Mishnah, 150 years before the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, 100 years before the Common Era. We find in Amora, a Gemara era figure, Shmuel, and another Amora of Nachman, discussing the legitimacy and viability of the Pruzbul. We're now talking about the year 300, 400 after the Common Era. So from 500 years after Hillel, there's still debate around the viability of Pruzbul and how it should be expressed. Rav Nachman, after whom we paskin, is a very strong supporter of this Pruzbul legislation. It's possible, for example, that when Hillel made the decree, he simply meant it as an ad hoc solution for just a particular era in history when he saw this problem, and Rav Nachman revolved it out for all time. But either way, the evolution of the Pruzbul as a sort of mass phenomena took time. There may even have been periods in history in which the Pruzbul became so predominant that it no longer actually had to be made. In other words, there was an assumption that every debt had an unspoken clause in it in which it was specified, and I wish this debt to be in line with Pruzbul laws, and therefore I don't even need to make the documentation at all. It's possible again that Rav Nachman was of the belief. So the exact workings of how the Pruzbul should be applied is a complicated topic. Yeah, Alex, yeah.
Did that mean that for so that would be like easier, or so people don't Schmidt? It just makes an easy person to collect their debts without doing more laws.
His goal is to stop people desisting from lending, which messes up both the rich and the poor.
So it wasn't just for Schmidt.
On a practical level, it's only relevant to Shemitta, because the reason people resist lending is because they're worried about Shemitta, and therefore he made this takana in order to avoid Shemitta on a practical level, cancelling debt, so that rich people continue to lend, the capital rich would continue to lend the capital poor money.
Why can't it work all year? All year, because it's easier if everyone's loan.
No, because it's not relevant. In normal years, Shemitta doesn't cancel anything. There's no reason I should need to hand over my stories to Beit Din, my documentation Beit Din, unless I have a particular problem and I need to begin mounting a claim. Normally speaking, I lend you money, it's a private personal transaction. There's no reason for Beit Din to get involved. He wasn't reforming how Beit Din in general work. It was a narrow, targeted reformation of how I hand over stories to Beit Din, in which it was streamlined because there's a mass need for that to occur over Shemitta. More generally, there's a broader discussion about whether this streamlined process that Hillel developed is effective at all as far as Torah law is concerned. In other words, whilst literal handing over of a claim to Beit Din works, by the time I've finished and I've sort of created this ritualistic handing over of Beit Din, is that effective at all as far as Torah law is concerned? And again, just for understanding the background to this, there's a number of ways of understanding the topic. One school of thought is that yes, this is an effective method of dealing with Shemitta. The Torah says loans are cancelled. However, if the loan is handed to Beit Din and enforceable by Beit Din, it won't be cancelled. And this is a streamlined process. It's a clever chap. It's a clever sort of a way working around. Effectively, I'm just using Beit Din systems to make things as simple and as easy as possible. And this is an effective Torah solution to avoiding the cancellation of loans. That's one model. A second model argues that Shemitta bisman hazeh is anyway rabbinic. It's drabanan. Why would Shemitta be rabbinic nowadays? Because let's not forget that the core halacha of Shemitta is an agricultural one. Farmers can't farm. The fruit and vegetable that has grown in Shemitta, so as Torah law is concerned, has to be hefker. Anyone's allowed to help themselves to it, and so on and so forth. And many agricultural laws are suspended as far as Torah law is concerned nowadays. Why would they be suspended nowadays? Because there's a halacha that Eretz Yisrael, I've spoken about this before, and we've spoken about what we mean by Eretz Yisrael. Eretz Yisrael means the land of Yisrael, the land occupied by Yisrael, and at least where we don't have Rov Yoshbeah or Leha, we don't have the majority of the Jewish population living in the lands of Israel. Many of the laws, or agricultural laws, including the tithing laws of Trumas and Maitras, are drabanan, and therefore Shemitta may be part of that family of halachas, and this may even extend to Shemittas Kosofim, to the Shemitta laws that involve financial matters. In other words, fundamentally, again, as we began, Shemitta means many things. It means withdrawal, but it means withdrawal from agricultural practice, I don't farm. It means withdrawal from ownership of fruit and veg that grow, and it means withdrawal from debt. Withdrawal from debt in and of in itself is not an agricultural law. It's an obligation on me as a financial being. Nonetheless, since these are all part of the package deal of Shemitta, according to Rabbi Yehuda Nossi, the editor of the Mishnah, this is rabbinic nowadays. There is a Rabbanon, the majority opinion is that Shemittas Kosofim is Torah law nowadays. However, Rabbi Yehuda Nossi, and according to many posting, this is how we paskin, holds that even Shemittas Kosofim is only rabbinic nowadays because it's linked to the agricultural laws of Shemitta. So we end up with a very interesting thing. Shemitta is fundamentally an Eretz Yisrael-based halacha, agricultural halacha, and therefore perhaps not derais or not Torah law nowadays because it's an Israel-based halacha, now it's Israel-based halacha. Shemittas Kosofim, the monetary aspects of Shemitta, are a gavra-based, a human-based set of halachas, and not a land-based set of halachas, which apply according to most authorities even here in Chutz La'aretz. Nonetheless, because they are one halachic package of the laws of Shemitta, according to Rabbi Yehuda Nossi, they are rabbinic nowadays. If that's the case, that they are rabbinic nowadays, then again, we would understand more easily how Hillel could make this decree, because Hillel says, look, in the onset of the second temple era, the second Beis Hamikdash era, Chazal created drabanan, this aspect of the law of Shemitta, but with the exile of the first Beis Hamikdash, we lost the majority of Jews living in the lands of Israel, therefore this is rabbinic. Since the rabbis introduced this, I'm now reeling back a little of their takana, and I'm introducing the idea of Pruzbul. It doesn't need to be a Torah working mechanism. It's enough that it rabbinically works, since the whole law of the cancellation of debts is a rabbinic one. Yes?
If it's a mitzvah,
yes.
Could we differentiate between a debt in Israel and a debt in Shemitta?
So this is an excellent question. The question being asked is differentiating between a debt in Eretz Yisrael and a debt in Chutz. There is a minority opinion that argues this. The majority of the opinion says this doesn't make sense. The core laws of Shemitta are agricultural laws in Eretz Yisrael, but the law of monetary Shemittas Kasofim is one that applies everywhere. So effectively what Hillel is saying is as follows. The truth is, says Hillel, in this line of thought, Shemittas Kasofim, the cancellation of debts, shouldn't really apply nowadays as far as Torah law is concerned. Nonetheless, Chazal wanted us to keep it so that we are still familiar with these halachos, we still live with these halachos, we still get the spiritual input of these laws. By creating the Pruzbul, I'm ensuring that value remains. We don't forget the concept of Shemitta cancelling debt, but I also effectively annul it in practice as a very easy workaround. And that doesn't matter because the same Rabbanan who created this law are the same Rabbanan who are now rolling it back by creating a workaround. And at least we're still reminded of the concept of Shemitta because here we are all sitting here today online and in person worrying about sorting out that our debts don't get cancelled. So this is a second way of understanding it. A third model of understanding this is that this, again, is not really an effective Torah tool in and of itself. However, the courts have the limited ability to declare ownerless property or to transfer ownership of property based upon particular societal needs. This is known as a concept called hefka based in hefka, that besides courts 99% of the time applying rules of justice, of mishpat, and working out who owes what and enforcing that, on occasion where there's a communal need, they can actually transfer ownership. And then the third mechanism that the Gemara introduces into this is really Shemitta is Torah law. Really the Pruzbul is ineffective. It's lost the reality of handing over documentation to Beit Din. It's such a streamlined system that it's lost effectiveness as far as Torah law is concerned. Nonetheless, the authority of the Beit Din is such that it can transfer ownership and recreate a loan even though the Torah has cancelled it. So these are the different models of how the Pruzbul works, whether it genuinely is an effective tool or not as far as Torah law is concerned, and how it should be achieved. Now, we have numerous practical questions to answer, some of which are being posted up on the chat group as I speak, as to how this works, how it should be done, and which debts which loans it applies to. So first of all, how is a Pruzbul made on the ground? And then, let's just first of all talk about which debts this applies to, and do I actually need to make a Pruzbul? And the answer is we encourage everyone to make a Pruzbul. Why do we encourage everyone to make a Pruzbul? Well, certainly if you've lent money to anyone, you should make a Pruzbul. Even if you cannot, as of this moment, think of anyone you've lent money to, you may have forgotten, you may become aware that you owe someone money, and therefore it makes sense to do so. Perhaps cases of debts that one may not automatically think of, if you have a bank account in Israel, for example, so the having a bank account where you have a deposit in the bank account is effectively lending money to a bank. And a bank is ultimately owned by its shareholders, the majority of whom, or all of whom, if it's in Israel, may be Jews, in which case I wouldn't be allowed to claim my debt back off the bank. I retrieve my money from the bank account. So if you have a bank account in Israel, then this may be again an example of a loan that you want to claim. If you've done the extraordinary chesed of lending money to a gemach, again I mentioned that lending money is a mitzvah. It's a wonderful form of tzedakah, perhaps the most elevated form of tzedakah. So if you've deposited money with a gemach such that they can lend it out to people in need who need it, with the understanding that you can reclaim the money from the gemach if you need the money back, then again, without a Pruzbul, you may be unable to claim the debt, and therefore it is appropriate to make a Pruzbul. Pruzbul, because Shemitta will cancel it. Pruzbul can also apply to objects, and here I need to clarify a mistranslation or a confusion of concepts between a lost translation between Hebrew, Lashon HaKodesh, and English. So in English, we talk about borrowing money and also borrowing a pen or borrowing a car or borrowing a pot and a pan from your neighbor. In Lashon HaKodesh, there are two words for these concepts. Halva is when I borrow something such that the original object isn't returned, but merely replacement of the original object. So if I lend you £50, I don't expect to get back the same £50 note. I'm given a payment back of the value which I lent you. On the other hand, when I lend you an object, my car or the pen or the pot and pan, I expect, all else being equal, to get the object back unless you smash up the car or snap the pen or the like. So in Hebrew, a loan in which I'm lending something of value, expecting to get the value back, whether it's a £50 note or a cup of milk, is a halva. Whereas if I am merely lending you to borrow something to use, this is called she'ela, and there I expect to get the original object back, and this is a different type of borrowing. It's interesting, in English we don't distinguish with that in normal usage of the language, but conceptually these are two very different sorts of transactions. One is lending, halva, liquid, money that's meant to be spent, or objects that are meant to be used up, and I get back the value of that. That's how it's repaid. In the other case, it's she'ela, you're borrowing an object and will give me the object back. She'ela, to borrowing objects, specific concrete objects, where the very object itself is expected to be returned, the laws of Shemitta don't apply. This is not halva. The laws of Shemitta apply to the lending of value. However, the lending of value can be cash, and the lending of value can also be objects. So if I lend you a bottle of oil, I'm in the middle of cooking, and I realize I'm out of oil, and I dash around to my neighbor to borrow a bottle of oil, or we run out of milk and I want my cup of coffee, and that's borrowed, or you give me 6 eggs because I'm baking a cake. In all these scenarios, you don't get back the original eggs, the original oil, the original milk, the original salt, because that's the whole point, in which case this counts as halva, and the debt would apply to that. So Pruzbul should be applied and works in the case of monetary debts. It applies to debts which are made with documentation or without documentation, known in halacha as milva al pair or milva b'ksav, whether it's written or not. It applies to friendly debts, in which I loan a friend or a family member who I have absolute trust and no concerns about their honesty. Nonetheless, Shemitta will cancel it, so they can be completely honest and turn to me and say, if you didn't do a pruzbul, I don't wish to pay back, not because I'm a thief, but because the Torah has granted the cancellation of the debt. Debts which are not cancelled by Shemitta include debts which were never advanced as a formal loan. So, for example, money owed because of services rendered, wages owed because of salary to be paid. Those cases are not debts. They are money outstanding, but they've never been formally made into a debt, unless I convert it into a debt. Meaning to say, if I owe you a salary and I say, look, I can't pay this month, are you okay with effectively lending me that money and I'll pay it next month? Then I've converted it into a debt. But normally speaking, this is not a debt. This is money owed, money outstanding, and Shemitta wouldn't cancel that. Similarly, school fees, if they're outstanding, if I buy money and credit from a shop, I have an account in K's or the like. In all these cases, the debt isn't cancelled because this was never created as a formal debt. It was simply money due as opposed to a debt mechanism. So this is the halacha of a pruzbul and the application of it to these scenarios. Okay, someone here has posted a question, so let me just catch up with the chat questions here. The chat, let's get this back up. Someone has asked if I have a heta iska, is that cancelled with, do I need a pruzbul for that or not? So, what is heta iska? And also bank as an institution, okay, which doesn't need a pruzbul. Fine. Okay, so let me answer both those questions. So it's complicated enough talking about pruzbul today. I'm not going to go into the mechanism of how a heta iska works, other than to explain the basis of the question is that a heta iska allows ribis, interest payments, by converting a debt into an investment. And the questioner correctly notes that Shemitta doesn't apply to investments, it applies to debts. So let me just point this out, since the questioner has flagged this. An investment, again, is not a debt. If I invest in your business, or I invest in your olive grove, and I get a share of the profits, this is not a debt. This is a share of profits. We are co-owners. Effectively, I'm a shutaf, a partner of sorts with yours. However, therefore, the questioner is asking, if a heta iska converts a debt into an investment, surely Shemitta should not apply. And the answer to the question, without going into the full details, is that a Heta Iska is only a partial conversion of the debt into investment. Some of the sums remain a debt, and therefore, even if you have a Heta Iska, a debt that such a debt needs a Pruzbul. The second question I was asked was, surely a bank is an institution, and therefore shouldn't need a Pruzbul. So again, this is a complicated matter, and let me just briefly explain the topic. There are situations where there is a corporate entity which effectively functions as a non-human player in finances. So for example, a tzedakah. No one owns the tzedakah. It's not that let's say we have a gemach here and there. So we have the Ner Yisrael gemach. It's not that the members of Ner or the trustees of the shul or the boards of the shul are the owners of the gemach. The gemach is a tzedakah. It's its own corporate identity. And the trustees of the gemach are trustees. In halacha, this is called an apitropos. They are the guardians of the money in the gemach to make sure it is distributed equitably and fairly and in line with the halachas of tzedakah and the like. So such an organization may not need, according to most poskim, does not need a Pruzbul because it is not a human being, it is a corporate body. However, a bank in general would be viewed as simply a very large-scale partnership. There's just many, many owners. It's a vast business with 1 million owners who are all shareholders in the bank, and therefore, as individuals, they need to create a Heta Iska because they are lending money or a share of the money to the investor, also known as the depositor, who puts the money into their current account. So when I put money in a bank, I'm effectively lending money to the bank. The bank, from a halachic point of view, is a partnership between a vast number of individuals, and therefore Heta Iska would be needed in that case. A Pruzbul, I'm sorry, thank you. A Pruzbul would be needed in that case because an individual owns the money. So this is the case of a Pruzbul. There are, I should mention, other solutions if one so chooses for the debt not to be cancelled by Shemitta. And here we get to a fascinating halachic topic. It's really a Gemara in Makkas and elsewhere that deals with this, which is, can I specify when I lend money that I don't want the debt to be cancelled by Shemitta? Now, there's two ways of looking at the matter. On the one hand, you could argue, Shemitta at the end of the day is a financial law of the Torah. And when human beings make financial agreements, they can create all sorts of terms and conditions. And therefore, I should be able to create a term and condition in my transaction, which says I don't want Shemitta to be to cancel the debt. The alternative viewpoint is effectively what I'm doing is trying to create a condition against how the Torah specifies the mechanism, Masner or Mashakasa Torah, creating a Tanai, the terms and conditions of a transaction against that which the Torah specifies. Now the Gemara introduces a subtlety over here, and this subtlety really forces us to think a little bit about how Shemitta works and in what way it cancels debt. If we look at the Psukim, the Torah really says 2 points. Again, the Pasuk says, we read out the Psukim, beginning with Kate Shevashonim at the end of the 7 years, and it seems to say, number one, the debt is cancelled, and number two, I shouldn't claim or press for the debt back. Meaning to say that it's not as simple as just the debt being cancelled. It's also I shouldn't claim the debt back. Now, if the debt is completely cancelled, then claiming the debt back is a nonsense. There is no claiming the debt back. I'm simply trying to embark on theft. So there's considerable discussion amongst the Rishonim as to what exactly is the mechanism of what Shemitta does. And the Gemara seems to say that whilst I can't make a condition with you that Shemitta won't cancel the debt, I can perhaps make a condition with you that you won't exercise your right of Shemitta and you will still pay me back. So this is an interesting subtlety over here. The Gemara in fact records that even Hillel aside, good practice is to pay debts back, seeming to indicate that the debt is not completely cancelled. In fact, the Gemara says that what happens if you didn't make a Pruzbul and someone approaches you after Shemitta and says, I want to pay the debt back. Are you allowed to accept the money? I didn't ask you for it. I was a good, halachically observant Jew. I didn't ask for the money back, and you now approach me and say, I want to pay the money back. So the Gemara says, I should really say, it's Shemitta, I don't have a right to it. But if you say, nonetheless, I want to pay back, this is not a breach of the halachas of Shemitta. I'm allowed to accept the money. The poskim say that there's no soneh matanos yichya. in this situation. The halacha is that, or that not the halacha, the ethical advice is that one should try and avoid taking unnecessary gifts in life, right? Someone who hates gifts lives. We shouldn't go through life always looking for advantage that we can take from others. Nonetheless, this wouldn't apply in this case. It's not sona matanos yechia. At the end of the day, I lent you the money. The Torah creates the ability for you to avoid paying it back. If you choose to pay it back, then that's legitimate. The Gemara says more than that there were times when Chazal tried to persuade people to pay back debts. The same Gemara that I mentioned before, which the Gemara discusses Hillel's Pruzbul, and it's not clear cut whether, despite the takon of Hillel, Pruzbul was immediately came into action. The Gemara brings that Shmuel wasn't such a fan of Pruzbul, and Nachman supported Pruzbul. So in that same sugya, the Gemara discusses other ways of the Gemara, both above and Yishalmi, other ways. Maybe social pressure could be put on people to pay back debts, despite the halachas of Shemitta and the like. Beyond the Pruzbul as a solution, a debt in which I specify that you won't exercise your right of Shemitta, such a condition, according to the conclusion of the Gemara, is not masna al mashakasa Torah, is not in breach of negating Torah law, effectively trying to set up my own finances against Torah. If I try and make a condition that the debt won't be cancelled, I'm dealing with the reality. If that is cancelled, you can't make such a condition. That's trying to create terms and conditions against how the Torah set up finance. However, a situation where I merely ask you to not exercise or stipulate that you won't exercise your right to cancel the debt, that may be another workaround. What else can we say about the Pruzbul? So the Pruzbul cancels debts which are in existence at the point in time of making a Pruzbul. In Hashem, this evening, after this share, we will sit down as a Beit Din, and Rabbi Solomon, Rabbi Perlman have kindly joined us and agreed to be part of our ad hoc Nei Yisrael Beit Din on this occasion. And the Pruzbul will mean that you can claim any debts that you have lent until this point in time. Today is Wednesday, so Thursday, Friday, hopefully not Shabbos, and Sunday you still have opportunity to lend people. If you do so, such debts will not be protected by the Pruzbul because you haven't handed them over to Beit Din. So Pruzbul has to be made certainly every Shemitta. You can't rely on a Pruzbul made many years back, and you can't even rely on a Pruzbul done a month ago if you have since lent the money. So this is something to be aware of. This also, however, gives us the opportunity to fulfill a wonderful mitzvah, because there is a downside in the Pruzbul that we lose the mitzvah of Shemittas Kasafim. So Poskin, I think the Ben Ish Chai and others suggest that after making a Pruzbul, one should deliberately loan some money to someone. If you can find a worthy recipient, Matov Manoim, that's even better. And that Pruzbul will be cancelled by Shemitta, and you will both avoid the lava yigash, and you will fulfill the mitzvah saseh of Shomit, and so on, and therefore not claim the debt. So again, we started this year by talking in a sense about attention, that Hillel is trying to walk a tightrope between, on the one hand, the pasuk which gives us a wonderful mitzvah, and we discussed the reasons of the mitzvah, the sefer chinuch, the akedah, the mo'anavukim, are the beautiful ideas that lie behind the mitzvah. And on the other hand, Hillel was conscious that this was ending up in a result in which people weren't lending money. So the Pruzbul exists as a solution to that. If there was no Pruzbul, all of us would cancel our Israeli bank accounts, we would cancel any money we've given to Gamachim, we would have to call in the debts that we have outstanding, perhaps some family and friends that we're helping. Therefore, Pruzbul is a wonderful takon of Shmuel. However, the price that's paid is we lose this mitzvah, and therefore you can use this window of opportunity that's created by Pruzbul being created now on Wednesday night in order to genuinely fulfill this mitzvah. I'll just finish off, because we're running out of time, by talking a little bit about the means of creating a Pruzbul. And broadly speaking, as I said, the concept of Pruzbul is that you're handing over the chov to Beit Din. So how do you do that? So option number one is you go to an established Beit Din in town. We have the London Beit Din, we have the Federation, and you find an opportunity to create a Pruzbul directly with them. There are views in the Gemara, and this is the view of the Shulchan Aruch, that this is the only way to create a Pruzbul. It has to be done with an established, genuine, permanent sitting based in one of the Beit Din of the city. And this is how the Shulchan Aruch paskins for Sfardim. So Sfardim who are listening online or to the share should be conscious that really the ideal Pruzbul that a Sfardi should make should be with a genuine sitting Beit Din. However, there are more paskins that it is legitimate to make an ad hoc Beit Din for this purposes. And that's the basis of the Beit Din that we will make here in a few moments, in which I'll sit with my dear colleagues who have given up some time in order to make a Beit Din and do a Pruzbul here at this time. If one isn't able to exercise either of these options, there is a third mechanism that can be done, which is a shliach, an agent. In other words, appointing someone as an agent to make the Pruzbul for them. I'll post on the chat group, and actually I'll also put on, we'll send out an email, a link to an online Google form that you can fill in which you appoint me as your agent, and I will then go to one of the Beit Din and do a Pruzbul on your behalf. Advantage of this is that it works. It's a method of doing the Pruzbul. Disadvantage is that the mechanism of creating shlichus and whether this needs to be done in front of eidim, witnesses, isn't that clear cut. Basically, there are more paskins that you can do what I've just described, which is appoint someone as shliach. It can be done via a Google form. That's a legitimate way to do it, and that notifies me that I am your shliach, and I will do the Pruzbul for you. So again, I've just posted a link in the chat, and we'll send it out by email. Till 10 p.m. on Motzei Shabbat, anyone can add their name on the form, and on Sunday morning, Erev Rosh HaShana, I will do the Pruzbul for you. There are minority opinions, Chayodom and others, who are of the belief that since this is a financial transaction, to be real and genuine, it needs to be done in the presence of two witnesses, and therefore filling in the Google form is insufficient. The core halachas like the Ramah, however, certainly in Chatzchila, if a Pruzbul can be done live, that's better, which is why we ran this year live and why we'll do a Pruzbul at this moment in time. And this is the manner and effect in which a Pruzbul can be achieved. I think we'll stop there, given that we've used our time. Let me just see if there's any particularly important halachas that I wanted to mention. I think for now that's enough. I'm not going to go into the details now if one forgot to write a Pruzbul what to do, because I'm speaking to people who are attending this year and therefore are doing a Pruzbul. If after Rosh HaShana you realize you forgot to write a Pruzbul, we can discuss that at length. And for now, I'll simply conclude by saying that, as I mentioned, this is a wonderful mitzvah. This is an opportunity to, if one cancels debts after the Pruzbul has been written, to be mekayim this mitzvah. The Pruzbul, as per Hillel, is in line with the takana of that. And I think there's also a message behind this. I think this time of year of Rosh HaShana, being reminded to let go of things that people owe us is no bad mosar. I think we all carry around with us pekelach, sackloads of moral debts that we feel people owe to us, people that have hurt us and offended us, sometimes our nearest and dearest, our children, our parents, our spouses, our siblings, our friends, our community. And surely if we daven that HaKadosh Baruch Hu should let go of the chovos that we owe him, we in turn should be able to let go of the debts that others owe us. I don't normally quote the Hasidic thinkers, but the Hasidic thinkers say that the year of a Shemitta, the Rosh HaShana of a Shemitta, is a special time, because if we fulfill the mitzvah of letting go of our debts, then in turn HaKadosh Baruch Hu will let go of the debts that we owe them. I've got a couple of questions on the chat, and then I'll finish. Someone asked about yes, what happens if they haven't made a Pruzbul in the past and they've got debts from 7 years ago? Let's speak about that off group. It ties into what I very briefly mentioned, which is the view of one reading in Rav Nachman, who says that a Pruzbul is there by default, and therefore maybe with the Eved one can rely on that view. Ramesh Feinstein was of that opinion, by the way. If one forgot to make an opinion, one can claim a debt. Do a husband and wife each need to make a Pruzbul? So I should have mentioned, Pruzbul in principle is made by men and women. There isn't in and of in itself a halachic difference. A Pruzbul also, by the way, should be made by a child if a child has independent financial means and has lent money. Nonetheless, if a husband and wife have shared financial affairs, certainly in the classic din of Shulchan Aruch and Gemara and Mishnah, there was an assumption of that a husband ran the financial affairs. And it depends how a couple arrange their financial affairs. It could be if they have joint financial affairs, then one can do it on behalf of both. Otherwise, both should do it. In other words, the wife has and the husband has separate financial accounts and separate running of their money. And finally, I was asked, how long will I be here with our Beit Din this evening? If those of you listening online, if you live close enough and you come over straight away, we can still do the Pruzbul. So I'll stop there and ask some questions. Yes, Ben.
If there is a debt of time,
yes,
rather than of monetary value, but
yes,
you are the recipient or the beneficiary of somebody who's going to owe you
yes,
certain things for you.
yes.
Is that potentially caught by a Pruzbul and then
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. If, let's say you're, for example, paid someone in advance and a poil, a worker, and then they owe you a job done, or you've paid in advance for an item, for a good, and they owe you that item. So neither of those cases are halva. So we spoke about she'ela as not being halva, and we spoke about money due as not being a halva. And in this case over here, even if it's an object, it's due as opposed to be a halva, and therefore it wouldn't apply. And if it's, I don't know in halacha if we have a concept of time owns, but we definitely have a concept of service owns or work owns, in which case it would not be a halva, and this would not be cancelled. Yes. So did you want to?
Is there a way of doing a community-wide Pruzbul for those that figure?
There isn't in and of in itself a way to do a communal Pruzbul because it's an individual personal transaction. There are places can we discuss the idea of zochin. So I can very briefly, we discussed shlichus, someone appointing me as a shliach to do the Pruzbul for you. Then there's a halachic concept called zochin, which is a presumption of shlichus if something is in your benefit. So for example, if you wish to give Reuven a gift, and Reuven isn't here to receive it from you, so you can say to me, Rabbi Zobin, can you be koine on behalf of Reuven as a self-appointed shliach through the mechanism of zochin? So there is discussion whether you could do a zochin mechanism for a Pruzbul. It's beyond the scope of the shir to discuss what the arguments either way would be. I've run out of time. There are many other things that are interesting to talk about. We haven't had time to discuss the debt that only becomes due after Shemitta. We haven't had time to discuss the halachic status of a check and whether that's considered a debt or merely an instruction to a bank to pay. So there's many other scenarios that need to be thought about. But I think for now, in fact, someone just asked a fixed term loan which straddles Rosh HaShana literally as I was speaking, is it subject to a Pruzbul? Generally speaking, loans which become due after Rosh HaShana, a Pruzbul is not necessary for. The reason I'm saying generally is because straddles Rosh HaShana would need unpicking exactly what that means. But in general, that wouldn't be the case. So we'll stop here. Thank you very much to everyone who's joined, and thank you to those who have come live. And I posted the link for those who are here for Minoi Shlichus, for appointment of agency online. And I think we'll stop now. We'll do a Beit Din with my fellow dיינים. So thank you very much. Okay, let's shut this down here. Just to explain to those who are here live, the text of the Pruzbul that we're using, so that then everyone can step forward and sign. So we say במושב שלשה דיינים כאחד, with three of us sitting here with my colleagues, three of us sitting here as one, היינו we are, ובעל לפנינו, and then we enter the name, so and so king in front of us, ואמר. So in signing the Pruzbul, you are declaring to us, היינו שנה זה בשנת השביעית. This year is the 7th year, ויש לי חובות בשטר ובעל. I have debts, both documented and oral, as we discussed the Pruzbul works of both. והריני מוסר אתכם פרוזבול שאני מרשה אתכם לגבות כל חובות שיש לי על איזה אנשים. And I hand over to this document, the Pruzbul, in which I authorize you to claim on my behalf all the debts which I have to claim against both men and ladies. And from now you should be for me this ad hoc Beit Din with Rabbi Perlman and Rabbi Dr. Leslie Solomon should be for me as dיינים ותקבלו עבורי, and you should claim and receive the payment of the debt on my behalf. If you're not able to claim yourselves, from now, since I've given to you this Pruzbul, and you go called I am entitled to directly claim any debt that I have till today. So this specifies that the Pruzbul only works for debts that are already existing, and it also specifies, as we discussed, that part of the leniency and streamlining of Hillel is that I don't need to turn to the Beit Din, otherwise my colleagues and myself would be very busy claiming all the debts on your behalf, but now you can directly claim it yourself as an action on behalf of the Beit Din, and therefore this is how Pruzbul works, as we discussed. Then in turn, ואמר based in שמענו דבריך, we the Beit Din declare that we heard your words, and we create a yipakar, a power of attorney. We authorize you, that the debt shouldn't be cancelled, and now all debts can be claimed to the Pruzbul, in line with the takon of Hillel, and as we discussed, the takon of perhaps evolved over time, and therefore in line with Chazal, how Chazal should debt ledgers work. And then Bana la Hasim is signed, Yom Kafar b'Chodesh Elul Shnas Toshin Beis, today the 26th of Elul in 5782, Ho Be'er London Habira in the capital city of London, and then we, the three Dayanim, will fill in the bottom of the form. So that's how the Pruzbul works, and I will paste a link in the description of the YouTube version of this to the text of the Pruzbul that we've used here. And once again, thank you so much to everyone for joining, and to all those who will be doing the Pruzbul live with us. And may we all share a year of bracha and success.